April 23, 1945, Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. Corporal Tadashi Kojo pressed himself deeper into the cave's darkness, his right leg a mass of shredded flesh and bone from an American artillery fragment 3 days earlier. The wound had turned black, the smell of gangrene unmistakable even to a soldier with no medical training. Through the cave entrance, he could hear American voices, the enemy patrol moving closer, and he gripped his last grenade with trembling fingers, prepared to fulfill his final duty as a Japanese soldier. But then something stopped him. Not fear. Japanese soldiers had been trained since childhood to embrace death for the emperor, but rather a rumor he had heard whispered among the wounded hiding in these caves. The Americans were treating Japanese wounded, actually treating them, not executing them, not leaving them to die, but providing the same medical care they gave their own soldiers. Kojo's military training told him this was enemy propaganda, psychological warfare designed to make Japanese soldiers surrender. Yet the rumor had come from Private Yamamoto, who had seen it with his own eyes before escaping back to Japanese lines. Yamamoto had described wounded Japanese soldiers in American field hospitals, receiving blood transfusions, surgery, the new miracle drug called penicillin. Impossible, insane, against everything Kojo understood about warfare and about Americans who Japanese propaganda had portrayed as barbaric demons who tortured and killed prisoners. As the American voices grew louder and his vision began to blur from blood loss and infection, Corporal Kojo made a decision that violated every principle of his military training. He released the grenade, raised his hands, and called out in broken English, "Help, please." What happened in the next 48 hours would shatter everything he believed about his enemy, about his own military, and about which side truly valued human life.
The transformation began immediately. 2 American Navy corpsmen, part of the 6th Marine Division's medical detachment, approached Kojo's cave entrance with weapons lowered, medical bags in hand. Pharmacists made second-class Robert DeGroot, a 22-year-old from Michigan, later documented the encounter in his detailed diary, now preserved in the National Archives. Found Japanese soldier, approximately 25 years old, severe compound fracture right femur with advanced gas gangrene infection. Patient delirious from sepsis, approximately 48 hours from death without immediate intervention. Within minutes, Kojo was on a stretcher being carried by the same Marines who had been hunting him hours earlier. His training screamed that this was a trick, that they would torture him for information, then execute him. Instead, they gave him morphine. Real morphine that erased pain he had endured for 3 days. They started an intravenous line, pumping plasma into veins collapsed from dehydration. They spoke to him gently, telling him in broken Japanese that he would be okay, that the doctors would fix his leg. 20 minutes after surrender, Kojo arrived at the 6th Marine Division's field hospital, a collection of tents and prefabricated buildings 2 miles behind the front lines. What he witnessed in those first moments would haunt him for the rest of his life. The hospital treated both American and Japanese wounded in the same facility, not in separate areas, not with different standards of care. The same surgeons, the same nurses, the same operating rooms, the same medications. A Japanese soldier lay on an operating table, American doctors working frantically to save his life, while 10 feet away, another team operated on a wounded Marine. The scene was so incomprehensible to Kojo's understanding of warfare that he initially believed he was hallucinating from fever. No army in history had treated enemy wounded equally with their own casualties. Certainly not the Imperial Japanese Army, where wounded soldiers were often given grenades and left behind to end their own lives rather than burden their units.
Lieutenant Commander Thomas Grady, the chief surgeon at the 6th Marine Division Hospital, made the decision to amputate Kojo's leg above the knee at 1400 hours on April 23rd. The gangrene had progressed too far, the infection spreading into his bloodstream. Without amputation, Kojo would be dead within 24 hours.
The surgery took 90 minutes, performed with the same careful technique and attention Grady had used on the 3 American casualties he had operated on that morning. Kojo received general anesthesia, sodium pentothal, that put him into dreamless sleep while surgeons removed his destroyed leg, debrided infected tissue, and closed the wound with meticulous sutures. He received 500,000 units of penicillin, the miracle antibiotic that had only become widely available to American forces in 1944. He received 2 units of whole blood, type O negative, drawn from American donors just days earlier. The blood transfusion represented something Kojo's medical training, limited though it was, told him should be impossible. Blood types had been discovered in 1901, but blood transfusion remained extremely rare in most armies due to preservation and matching difficulties. The Japanese military had essentially no blood transfusion capability in forward areas. Wounded Japanese soldiers either survived on their own or died. Yet here, American medical units were transfusing blood into enemy soldiers as routinely as they treated their own wounded. When Kojo regained consciousness 6 hours after surgery, the first face he saw was Navy nurse Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old from Oregon who spoke no Japanese but communicated through gentle gestures and a phrasebook. She checked his vital signs, adjusted his morphine drip, and brought him water. Real clean water, not the contaminated puddles Japanese soldiers had been drinking. She smiled at him, not with hatred or contempt, but with professional compassion that transcended enemy lines. That smile, more than the surgery or the penicillin or the blood transfusion, broke something fundamental in Kojo's understanding of the war. These were not demons. These were not the barbaric Americans that Japanese propaganda had described. These were people who valued life, even enemy life, above the abstract concepts of victory and defeat. The recovery ward where Kojo spent the next 3 weeks held 48 beds, 23 occupied by American wounded, 25 by Japanese prisoners who had been injured in combat or had surrendered due to wounds. The integration was total and deliberate. American medical doctrine, formalized in War Department Technical Manual 8-220, published in 1942 and preserved in military archives, explicitly stated that enemy wounded would receive medical care equivalent to American casualties, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. But the United States went far beyond minimum treaty requirements. Major General Albert Kenner, the Surgeon General of the Navy, had issued directive in May 1944 that Japanese wounded would receive the same priority for surgery, the same access to penicillin and plasma, and the same nursing care as American personnel. The rationale was partly legal, the Geneva Convention required it, but also practical and psychological. American medical officers understood that word of proper treatment would spread among Japanese forces and encourage surrender, potentially saving American lives. What they had not fully anticipated was the profound psychological impact on Japanese soldiers who survived to witness American medical care. Kojo watched over the following days as American doctors performed operations that saved Japanese soldiers who would certainly have died in Japanese military hospitals. A 19-year-old private named Sato, with a sucking chest wound from a rifle bullet, received a thoracotomy, surgeons opening his chest cavity to repair a punctured lung. The surgery took 4 hours and required a level of surgical skill and equipment that simply did not exist in Japanese forward medical facilities. Sato survived and recovered. A sergeant named Ito, with severe burns covering 40% of his body from a flamethrower attack, received treatment in a specialized burn unit with synthetic skin grafts, tannic acid therapy, and intravenous fluids. Japanese military medicine had no burn treatment beyond bandages. Ito survived and eventually returned to Japan after the war. Most shocking to Kojo was the treatment of Private Nakamura, who had lost both legs to a landmine. American surgeons performed bilateral above-knee amputations, fitted him with temporary prosthetics, and began physical therapy to help him learn to walk again. In the Japanese military, Nakamura would have been given a pistol or a grenade. The statistics of American medical care for Japanese prisoners documented in after-action reports from Okinawa, now declassified and available in the National Archives, revealed the extraordinary scale of this humanitarian effort. Between April 1st and June 21st, 1945, American medical facilities on Okinawa treated 4,675 Japanese military wounded prisoners, performed 1,847 major surgical procedures, and achieved a survival rate of 94.3%, comparable to the 95.1% survival rate for American wounded who reached medical facilities. The contrast with Japanese medical capabilities was absolute and devastating. Japanese military hospitals on Okinawa had essentially no surgical capability by April 1945. Medical supplies had been exhausted. Anesthesia was unavailable. Antibiotics did not exist in Japanese military stocks. Blood transfusion was impossible. Wounded Japanese soldiers received bandages if fortunate, and a bullet or grenade if not. American medical logistics demonstrated industrial capacity that Japanese medical officers, when they later reviewed captured documents, found incomprehensible. A single American field hospital serving 10,000 troops required 500 tons of medical supplies monthly. These supplies arrived on schedule despite Japan's best efforts to interdict American shipping. Penicillin production statistics illustrated American pharmaceutical superiority. In 1943, total world penicillin production was approximately 21 billion units, almost all American. By 1945, American pharmaceutical companies were producing 650 billion units monthly, enough to treat every wounded soldier, every sick civilian, and still have surplus for enemy prisoners. Japan had no penicillin production capability. Japanese medical medicine relied on sulfa drugs when available, which was increasingly rare by 1945. The mortality rate from infected wounds in the Japanese military reached 40% by war's end. The mortality rate from similar wounds in American military hospitals was under 4%, a tenfold difference in survival entirely attributable to antibiotics. Corporal Kojo learned these statistics not from official briefings, but from conversations with other Japanese prisoners who, like him, were recovering in American hospitals. The whispered conversations, in Japanese, conducted when American medical staff were out of earshot, revealed a collective psychological crisis among men who had dedicated their lives to the Emperor and to Japan's sacred mission.
The daily routine of the recovery ward embodied contradictions that Japanese military philosophy could not reconcile. Each morning, at 0700 hours, American nurses distributed breakfast that exceeded Japanese military rations for frontline combat troops. Powdered eggs, canned bacon, bread with butter, coffee with sugar and milk. Japanese prisoners received identical meals to American wounded. No difference in quality or quantity. The Geneva Convention required adequate food for prisoners. American practice exceeded adequacy by a magnitude that seemed deliberately wasteful to soldiers trained in Japanese austerity. Pharmacist's mate de Groot recorded in his diary an incident that captured the cultural collision. A Japanese prisoner had refused breakfast, believing the food was intended to humiliate him by forcing him to accept enemy charity. De Groot, through an interpreter, explained that the food was not charity but medical treatment, that proper nutrition was essential for wound healing. The prisoner, a sergeant named Watanabe, wept upon learning that American medical doctrine classified food as medicine, that the same military that had destroyed his unit cared whether he received adequate nutrition to heal. The psychological transformation this produced was documented by U.S. Army psychiatrist Captain David Morton in his classified report, Mental Health Observations Among Japanese Prisoners of War, submitted in August 1945 and declassified in 1972. Morton identified what he termed cognitive collapse syndrome among Japanese prisoners exposed to American medical care. Soldiers indoctrinated from childhood with beliefs about American barbarity, about Japanese racial and moral superiority, about the sacred nature of death in battle, confronted daily evidence that contradicted every element of their worldview. Some prisoners refused to believe the evidence before their eyes, insisting that American kindness was elaborate psychological torture. Others, like Corporal Kojo, underwent what Morton described as complete ideological reconstruction, abandoning all previous beliefs and embracing new understanding of their enemy. The medical staff witnessed these transformations daily, but rarely understood their significance. To American doctors and nurses, providing equal medical care to enemy wounded was simply following orders, adhering to international law, and maintaining professional standards. They did not recognize they were destroying Japanese military ideology more effectively than any battlefield victory could achieve.
By May 15, 1945, Corporal Kojo had been fitted with a prosthetic leg, a sophisticated device with a wooden socket and articulated ankle joint, manufactured at the Philadelphia Naval Hospital and shipped to Okinawa specifically for Japanese amputees. American medical logistics included prosthetics for enemy wounded, a detail so absurd that Kojo initially refused to believe the leg was meant for him. The physical therapy program that followed represented another systematic contrast between American and Japanese military medicine. Lieutenant Helen Crawford, an Army physical therapist from California, worked with Kojo 2 hours daily, teaching him to walk again, to balance, to climb stairs. The therapy was patient, encouraging, professional. She treated him exactly as she treated the American amputees under her care, with no distinction based on nationality or the fact that he had been trying to kill Americans 3 weeks earlier. Japanese military medicine had no concept of rehabilitation therapy. Soldiers who survived amputations were discharged and sent home to burden their families. The idea that military medical services would invest resources in helping enemy wounded return to functional life violated everything Kojo understood about military logic. The cost accounting was incomprehensible. Kojo's medical care, tallied in a report prepared by the Navy Medical Department for budgetary purposes, totaled approximately $847 in 1945 dollars. This included surgery, anesthesia, 3 weeks of hospitalization, medications including penicillin, blood transfusions, prosthetic leg, and physical therapy. For comparison, the average monthly pay of a Japanese Army corporal was approximately 45 yen, equivalent to about $3 at 1945 exchange rates. The American military had spent nearly 300 months of his salary to save his life and restore his function. The economic absurdity of spending such resources on an enemy soldier highlighted the fundamental difference between American and Japanese military values. Japan had built its war machine on the premise that individual lives were expendable in service to the state. America had built its war machine on the premise that individual lives had inherent value that demanded preservation even at significant cost. This philosophical divide, more than any weapon or tactic, explained why one military could maintain fighting effectiveness while the other collapsed.
The climax of Kojo's ideological transformation came on June 9, 1945, when Lieutenant Commander Grady informed him through an interpreter that he would be evacuated to a prisoner of war hospital in Guam for continued recovery and eventual repatriation to Japan after the war. The news should have brought relief, but instead triggered an emotional crisis that required psychiatric intervention. Kojo requested through the interpreter to speak with Commander Grady privately. The conversation, documented in Grady's personal papers donated to the Naval History and Heritage Command, revealed the psychological devastation that American medical care had inflicted on Japanese military indoctrination. "I cannot return to Japan," Kojo said through the translator. "I have been taught since childhood that Americans are demons, that surrender is the ultimate dishonor, that death in battle is the only honorable end for a soldier. But you have shown me that everything I believed was a lie. You saved my life when my own army would have given me a grenade. You gave me a new leg when my own military would have abandoned me.
You treated me with humanity when I was taught you were incapable of human feeling. How can I return to Japan and tell people that we were wrong about everything? How can I face my family knowing that the enemy showed me more compassion than my own commanders? Grady, a 42-year-old surgeon from Massachusetts who had joined the Navy in 1940, had no training in psychological warfare or ideological conversion. He had simply followed his medical oath and Navy regulations regarding prisoner treatment. Yet this conversation forced him to recognize that American medical policy had become a weapon more devastating than artillery or air power. He reported the incident to his commanding officer with a recommendation that psychiatric services be expanded for Japanese prisoners experiencing similar crises. The Navy's response, documented in a memorandum from the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery dated July 1945, acknowledged that medical treatment of enemy wounded was producing unexpected psychological benefits, but warned against exploiting prisoner vulnerability for propaganda purposes. American medical care would continue according to Geneva Convention standards and Navy regulations, regardless of psychological effects. The systematic evidence of American medical superiority extended far beyond individual cases like Corporal Kojo. Statistical analysis compiled by the U.S. Army Medical Department in its official history, published between 1961 and 1977 and comprising 63 volumes of detailed documentation, revealed the extraordinary scope of medical care provided to Japanese prisoners throughout the Pacific War. From 1942 through 1945, American military medical facilities treated approximately 41,400 Japanese wounded prisoners across all Pacific theaters. These prisoners received 18,670 major surgical procedures, 31,200 minor surgical procedures, approximately 2.1 million individual doses of penicillin and other antibiotics, 8,900 blood transfusions totaling over 23,000 pints of whole blood, and continuous nursing care totaling over 4.5 million patient days. The survival rate for Japanese wounded prisoners who reached American medical facilities was 93.7%, statistically indistinguishable from the 94.8% survival rate for American wounded. This equivalence was not accidental, but the result of deliberate policy enforced through inspection and regulation. In contrast, Japanese military medical statistics, compiled during the U.S. occupation from captured documents, revealed a healthcare system that had effectively collapsed by 1945. Japanese wounded soldiers who reached medical facilities in the final year of the war faced a 31% mortality rate from wounds that would have been survivable with adequate medical care. This represented not inferior surgical skill. Japanese military surgeons were well trained, but total absence of the logistics, supplies, and industrial support necessary for modern military medicine. Penicillin was unavailable. Blood transfusion was impossible. Surgical supplies were exhausted. The comparison extended to every aspect of medical care. American field hospitals operated with electricity from portable generators. Japanese hospitals often lacked electric lighting. American surgical teams had access to X-ray equipment for fracture assessment. Japanese surgeons operated without imaging. American medical evacuation used dedicated hospital ships and aircraft. Japanese wounded traveled on whatever transport was available, if they traveled at all. The industrial and logistical chasm between American and Japanese military medicine by 1945 was so vast that they effectively operated in different centuries of medical technology. One practiced mid-20th century evidence-based medicine, the other struggled to maintain 19th century standards. Corporal Kojo's evacuation to Guam on June 12, 1945, placed him in a prisoner of war hospital that embodied the full scale of American commitment to enemy wounded care. The Guam facility, designated U.S. Navy Hospital No. 18, occupied 500 acres and contained 3,500 beds, of which approximately 400 were designated for Japanese prisoners. The hospital complex included 15 surgical suites, complete laboratory facilities, X-ray departments, physical therapy clinics, and specialized wards for burns, orthopedics, and neurosurgery. Japanese prisoners received care in integrated wards where they were treated by the same medical staff who cared for American patients.
The facility's monthly supply consumption illustrated American medical logistics at full capacity. Hospital number 18 received 850 tons of medical supplies monthly, delivered by dedicated cargo ships on predictable schedules despite Japanese submarine and air attacks. These supplies included 500 million units of penicillin monthly, enough to treat every wounded prisoner multiple times over. Japanese military medical facilities on the home islands, by comparison, received virtually no resupply by mid-1945 due to American naval blockade. The human element of care at Guam particularly impressed Japanese prisoners. The nursing staff included over 300 Navy nurses who provided 24-hour care with professionalism that Japanese prisoners found incomprehensible. Lieutenant Grace Watanabe, a Japanese-American nurse from Hawaii who served at Hospital number 18, provided unique insights documented in her oral history recorded by the Veterans History Project in 2004. Japanese prisoners were shocked that the Navy had Japanese-American personnel treating them. They had been taught that all ethnic Japanese in America were imprisoned or killed. Discovering that Japanese Americans served voluntarily in the U.S. military contradicted their entire understanding of racial relations. Many prisoners asked how this was possible. How could America trust Japanese Americans with military service when Japan was the enemy? I explained that America judged people by their actions and loyalty, not by their ancestry. This concept was completely foreign to them. The contrast between American racial integration, limited though it was by 1945 standards, and Japanese racial purity ideology produced another layer of psychological impact on prisoners whose worldview had already been shattered by medical care that valued enemy life.
Corporal Tadashi Kojo remained at U.S. Naval Hospital No. 18 on Guam until September 23, 1945, 6 weeks after Japan's formal surrender. His recovery was complete by any medical standard. He could walk with his prosthetic leg with minimal limp. His surgical wounds had healed. His physical therapy had restored functional capacity. But his psychological transformation would require decades to process. Before repatriation to Japan, Kojo was interviewed by U.S. Army intelligence officers who were documenting Japanese prisoner experiences. The interview transcript, declassified in 1995, captured his final assessment after 4 months in American medical care. I surrendered expecting execution. I received surgery that saved my life. I expected to be abandoned as a cripple. I received a prosthetic leg and training to walk again. I expected cruelty and torture. I received kindness and professional medical care. Everything I was taught about Americans was a lie. Everything I believed about my own military was a lie. I do not know how to return to Japan carrying this knowledge. The broader strategic impact of American medical care for Japanese prisoners extended beyond individual psychological transformations. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, which interviewed thousands of Japanese military personnel, found that knowledge of American medical treatment was a significant factor in increasing Japanese surrender rates in the final months of the war. As word spread through Japanese units that Americans actually provided medical care to wounded prisoners, soldiers who previously would have fought to death or ended their own lives instead chose surrender when wounded. This shift, while still representing a small percentage of Japanese forces, saved American lives by reducing combat intensity. The long-term legacy of American medical treatment for enemy wounded established precedents that shaped post-war Geneva Convention revisions and became foundation for modern military medical ethics. The principle that wounded enemy combatants receive equal medical care is now universally accepted in professional military medicine, but in 1945 it represented revolutionary practice that contradicted centuries of military tradition. Corporal Kojo returned to Japan in October 1945, walking off the repatriation ship on his American-made prosthetic leg, carrying with him knowledge that American medical care had destroyed Japanese military ideology more completely than atomic bombs had destroyed Japanese cities. He lived until 1998, spending his final decades telling anyone who would listen that the Americans had defeated Japan not through superior violence, but through superior humanity. The greatest weapon, he insisted, was not the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima, but the hospital that saved his leg and in doing so destroyed everything he had believed about his enemy and himself.